All right. Well, welcome. My name is Mary Beth Gassman, and I'm a professor at Rutgers University. I also have the honor of being the executive director of both the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions and the Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice. And we are the sponsor of today's webinar. This webinar is part of a series that is funded by the Mellon Foundation. We are incredibly grateful to them for funding a series called Let's Talk Humanities, and it is associated with a program called the Hispanic Serving Institutions Pathways to the Professoriate Program, which focuses on having more Latinx scholars in faculty positions across the country. So today I am really, really thrilled um, uh, to have Alberto Ledesma with us, and he is going to be presenting a talk called Illustrating Silence, Familia, Invisibility, and the Semiotics of Undocumented Fear. So for those of you who don't know him, he is the Assistant Dean for Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity in the Arts and Humanities at Cal Berkeley. And I'm going to read his official bio, but I also want to say that I've had the pleasure of working with Alberto for several years. He is a wonderful scholar, a wonderful mentor to so many people, an amazing artist, and you'll see that he has done all of the drawings and paintings in this presentation. They are gorgeous, and he just has a really, really beautiful way of making words come to life, art come to life, and doing so much for others. And we really appreciate him being with us. So Alberto, I'm just going to read a little bit of your official bio so people will know a bit about you, and then I'm going to hand it over to you. So for those of you who don't know him, he grew up in East Oakland, California, and received his undergraduate and graduate degrees from UC Berkeley, where he earned a PhD in ethnic studies. Alberto is a former faculty member at Cal State Monterey Bay and a lecturer in ethnic studies at UC Berkeley. He's also held several staff positions across UC Berkeley during the last decade. He's been director of admissions at the School of Optometry and a writing program coordinator at the Student Learning Center. And his current position is the Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, or Inclusion and Equity in Arts and Humanities. I want to also point out that, he's a writer, so he's published articles and poetry and short stories across so many venues, and his essays have appeared in academic journals, but they've also appeared in Color Lines or New American Media, the Harvard Journal of Education. And one of the things that I love that he's written so much is his Diary of a Reluctant Dreamer, which I would say pick it up. It's wonderful. So with all that said, I want to say welcome, Alberto. I cannot wait to hear what you have to say. I'm just letting folks know if you have questions, Alberto is absolutely happy to answer them. Please put them in the Q&A and we will answer them after his presentation. So Alberto, take it away.
So thank you so much. I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to Mary Beth and the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions for their kind invitation. I was genuinely thrilled when Mary Beth approached me to share my work with you all. During my time collaborating with Mary Beth and the wonderful colleagues involved in the Mellon-funded Hispanic Serving Institution Pathways to the Professoriate Program, I was consistently impressed by the wealth of knowledge and insight each person brought to the table. From the HSI Pathway Fellows to the mentors, staff advisors, administrators, everyone contributed in meaningful ways. Mary Beth's leadership of the program led to fantastic results, and it's my deep respect for this community that makes me feel both humbled and excited to share my work with you today. Next slide, please. Before delving into our conversation, I do feel compelled to acknowledge the distressing events unfolding in Gaza and Israel. The crises there are deeply troubling, and though they may bear some resemblance to the issues at our southern border, it is vital to understand the unique histories and complexities inherent in each situation. Violence, particularly when it impacts innocent children, is never acceptable, regardless of its location in the world. It is disheartening to witness the persistence of such conflicts, often fueled by misunderstandings rooted in deep-seated disparities in history and culture. At a time when we don't seem to want to listen to each other in a respectful way without first prejudging what we're about to hear, I am hoping that the humble anecdotes that I'm about to share with you will begin to help you understand how my own undocumented life as a pre-American citizen represents only a partial glimpse into what this experience may be like for the 11 million or so people who now reside in the United States as undocumented immigrants. A word about the structure of my presentation. While I will be reading from prepared comments, you will see images that I have included from my book scrolling on slides that I have prepared as I do my talk. You should know, however, that my book is made up of a combination of illustrations and personal essays. Some of what you see here is included in the book. Some of what you see here I have added from other work. Next slide, please. If you had asked me as a young child in 1974 whether I could envision myself as a college student, a professor, or a college administrator, my response would have been a resounding no way. Back then, the concept of college was foreign to me. I had no understanding of its significance or why pursuing a degree would be beneficial. I was simply an undocumented immigrant kid attending Woodland Elementary School in East Oakland, striving to adhere to my parents' wishes and avoid anything that might jeopardize our residency. In truth, I was too young when my family first arrived in 82nd Avenue in 1974 to grasp the implications of being undocumented. I often heard my father cautioning, siempre ten cuidado, Alberto, always be careful, because your actions on the streets of Oakland affects us all. It was my father's admonitions, his insistence on vigilance, that first prompted me to question why we lived as we did. Why were we confined to our rented home in East Oakland? What did we gain in return, besides the meager earnings my father managed to bring in while we remained hidden and silent, far from our true home? Was it truly worth it? After decades of working directly with undocumented students at UC Berkeley and California State University, Monterey Bay, both before and after the adoption of AB 540, the California Assembly bill that allowed undocumented students to attend college without incurring out-of-state tuition, I've come to understand that this question, is it worth it, is one of the most enduring quandaries that they face. I've also come to recognize the complex relationship between undocumented students and their parents, a relationship fueled both by frustration in understanding their decisions and a desire to fulfill their wishes. This dynamic lies at the heart of the enigma of being an undocumented American. Next slide, please. The experience of being undocumented presents a profound ethical complexity, one that those of us who have lived through this status must grapple with deeply. Yet when the term illegal is incessantly employed to reduce the identity of an entire class of people, it not only strips away our humanity, but also diminishes and oversimplifies the ethical dilemmas we ourselves confront regarding the decisions our parents have made. For me, these existential questions surrounding my undocumentedness weighed heavily on my mind during my initial years in the US. While my parents emphasized the importance of being good and obedient, encouraging me to excel academically and attend church regularly, our family also discussed our status as ilegales and indocumentados in hushed tones, creating a sense of contradiction. It wasn't until high school that ethical turmoil regarding my undocumented immigrant identity reached a critical juncture. Allow me to share how it unfolded. Despite my parents' dedication to providing my siblings and me with a better life, they also stressed the importance of excelling in school so that we could pursue careers that engaged our minds rather than our physical labor. At Woodland Elementary School and Havenscourt Junior High, where my siblings and I were among the few immigrant students in predominantly African American communities, I find myself spending most of my time studying alone in the library, striving to fulfill my parents' directives. Upon transferring to Fremont High, where the student body consisted of 50% Latino and 50% African American students, I saw an opportunity for a fresh start. However, I quickly realized that not all Latino students shared the same experiences. A stark division emerged between recently arrived immigrant students and those born in the United States. Given that none of the other Latino students knew me, having come from the predominantly African American side of town, the choice of which group to align myself with fell surely on my shoulders. Next slide, please. That's when I became Beto, the hyper-documented Bato Loco, my first attempt to hide my undocumented immigrant identity in the US. For me, adopting this disguise felt like adhering to a set formula. The native-born Latino voice at Fremont High had a distinct style. They meticulously combed their hair into neat pompadours, donned plaid Pendleton dress shirts, and sported crisply ironed khaki pants. I persuaded my father that dressing in this manner would safeguard our family from deportation, and he agreed to purchase similar clothing for me. I must have appeared rather peculiar as I transformed from one day to the next, spending my lunch times in Fremont's courtyard with a thick book in one hand and a sandwich in the other, dressed identically to the group of boys who often gathered in front of the vice principal's office. These boys would deliberately pass by me, shooting menacing glares and questioning my neighborhood affiliation. To avoid trouble, I simply smiled and kept to myself. However, Fremont's teachers were intrigued by me for different reasons. One teacher, Mrs. Keller, approached me and remarked, Alberto, considering your performance in my class and your dedication to reading outside, I believe you have a strong chance of attending college. But to achieve that, you'll need to do more than just read novels during lunch. Have you considered participating in extracurricular activities, perhaps student government? Her question lingered with me, but it wasn't until my senior year that I ran for secretary of Fremont High's senior class, and I won. Now, don't be impressed, I ran unopposed. It seemed that nobody in my senior class, in a high school with almost 3,000 students, a class made up of hundreds of seemingly ambitious and talented young people, wanted anything to do with being secretary of Fremont High's senior class. Soon I found out why. Nobody told me that the main responsibility of the secretary was to keep notes for all of our student government meetings. That that meant that out of all the officers, I was the one who could never be late or absent for any meeting because I had to take the minutes for all of our sessions. I also had to attend all the gatherings between the student body president and principal and had to help with the financial record keeping and with doing flyers when we had school events. When I complained at home about all the work, Papa and Mama were not sympathetic at all. They were already doing double shifts each day with their own obligations. That's what you wanted, was all they said. A couple of months into the academic year, Edward, the kid who had been elected as our student body president, announced that he had decided to immediately resign because his father needed him to help out at the family restaurant, a busy establishment they ran in the Fruitvale district. When our government teacher asked if there was anyone who wanted to take over Edward's duties, I immediately raised my hand. I still remember that afternoon after I had been selected, how the principal announced my name over the school's loudspeakers. Effective immediately, he mumbled in his gravely drone. Alberto Ledesma will assume the position of Fremont High's new student body president. I could not believe it. Almost all my friends teased me about it the rest of the day. I could never anticipate, however, the surprise that was in store for me that night when I returned home. My mom called our small blue house on 82nd Avenue a tripa, an intestine, because of how long and narrow it was, with its small rooms stacked one after the other as if it were a wooden boxcar with an asphalt tile roof. The rooms were tiny, with windows that were hard to open and lights that went out whenever someone used the toaster while Mama was also ironing Papa's Levi's. The best room in the house, the one with the largest window and the most open space, was in the front. That's where Papa spent most of his time watching Canal 14 and waiting for his brothers back in Guadalajara to ring him on the green rotary phone that was affixed next to his chair. My room was at the very end of the tripa, a small storage space where Mama kept boxes of clothes that we had outgrown, but that she wanted to take back to Mexico, to our cousins, when the inevitable date of our return arrived. The beige boxes towered around a metal cot on which I slept and did my homework each night. I was thus surprised that night as I sat on my cot to do my pre-algebra homework when I heard my father's voice thundering all the way from the front of the house. Alberto, come quick. You have a phone call. I never got telephone calls. It's a girl, he added, and I especially never got calls from girls. Hola, Alberto. A girl's voice spoke my name as if whispering. How are you doing? I could never place the sound. I could not place the sound of her voice at first. Irma gave me your number, she said and paused, as if expecting me to know immediately who she and Irma were. I hope that it is okay that I called you. I continued to struggle to place her, confused because I had never really heard my name spoken by the person on the other side of the line. Then it hit me. The soft volume with which she pronounced her syllables, the way she finished her sentences as if they were questions. Next slide, please. It was Sonia Eugenia Flores, the exact girl that all my friends in sixth period gym spoke about nonstop when we played pickup games of basketball, the prettiest girl at school, and she was calling me. Hey, congratulations on becoming student body president, she said, and again, she waited. For a moment, before I told her that I recognized her, I felt suspicious. Maybe one of the guys at school had put her up to it, I thought. I just want to get to know you better and was wondering if you would want to hang out one of these days, she said. Man, I could not get the words out fast enough, especially when my dad gestured that I had to get off the phone because one of his brothers from Guadalajara might be trying to call him at that moment. Of course, I blurted, instantly ecstatic about the chance she had offered me, and one that all my friends would surely jump at had they themselves had the chance. You really seem to have it together, she said. I was suspicious at first, but for the next several months, after our initial conversation, we went everywhere in East Oakland that I could afford to take us with the small amount of money I earned from my part-time work at the Chuck Burger's family restaurant in San Leandro, where I worked on weekend mornings. Every Saturday and Sunday night, I filled my pants pockets with fistfuls of quarters I received as tips for cleaning tables and bussing dishes and coffee cups at the restaurants. And though I felt awkward stacking all those quarters on the counter whenever we went to the McDonald's by Alameda South Shore Mall, that tip money was still enough to pay for our weekend bus fares or for gas when my father lent me his station wagon. With it, we went to the movies, to the Grand Lake Theater, or to Fenton's for milkshakes. And when the quarters were scarce, it was Mama who would save the day by making us sandwiches, and I would just take Sonia for walks around Lake Merritt or along the Berkeley Marina. In all, Sonia seemed happy as we held hands, as if in spite of my poverty, she could actually see us making a life together. Next slide, please. It was on a cool Friday night in early April, a few days after I had received the thick envelope from Berkeley that was supposed to tell me if I would be going to college. A few months earlier, my counselor had sent my application without me knowing it. Here now was the result. I noticed that Sonia lingered a little longer than usual when we returned from our date. Boy George's Karma Chameleon had been playing on the radio as I pulled my father's station wagon to the front of her house. She turned towards me, smiled as she gave me a peck on the cheek, and began exiting. Then, right as she was about to close the door, she turned and asked if I could do her a big favor. For me, I worried about that letter that I had just received and that I had waited to open for almost 3 days. Finally, the previous night, I had gone into our bathroom after everyone in the house had gone to bed and turned that envelope open to see what the final decision had been. There, in the gloom of the moonlit bathroom, as I sat on the covered toilet, I had had to temper my euphoria at being admitted to UC Berkeley, to one of the world's best universities, because the letter also included a bill for several hundreds of dollars. How was I going to begin to pay even a part of these registration fees when all I had was a part-time job that barely provided enough money for a few cheap snacks and movie tickets? Papa had already warned me that though he wished he could support me more, he could not afford to give me that much money towards my studies. Sure, anything, I said as she held the station wagon's screen door ajar. And she stood with one foot on the pavement and the other one on the curb. For the first time since we have met, it was she who seemed hesitant. It's just that my sister and I, her thin eyebrows furrowed as she searched for the right words. Well, we need to take an urgent flight back to Mexico a week from today, and no one has been there to do us the favor. My mom is getting desperate and asked me to ask you, would you be able to borrow your desk station wagon to give us a ride to the San Francisco airport next week? We will only be gone a few weeks. I smiled to reassure her and to tell her that I would be happy to help her. And though I also wanted to tell her about my own anxiety about attending Berkeley, I kept that quiet. At home, Papa became angry because I had volunteered the use of his station wagon without me first asking him for permission. How do you know that I will not be using it myself? He said as I gave him back his keys. You just can't go around promising to do things for people that you might not be able to do. I tried to drive my father's station wagon across the Bay Bridge flawlessly when that night finally arrived. But the sea of cars that crowded at the toll booth required me to tap on the brakes more frequently than I wanted. Not that Sonia or her mother seemed to notice. Though it was a little past 8, a wall of red taillights brought us to a crawl, and I tried to merge into the quickest lanes that would get us to the San Francisco International Airport as soon as possible. Sonia's sister sat next to me. I hope everything goes well with your trip. I tried to break the ice. Sonia's sister was the only one to respond with a tentative, I hope so too. I looked on the rearview mirror and saw that Sonia had tears in her eyes and that her mother had placed her hand on Sonia's shoulder. Every now and then, I would try to make eye contact with her, but Sonia hardly looked and would instead lean closer to her mother to whisper. With the whir of the traffic And because I wanted to give them a smooth ride, I could barely catch passing phrases from what seemed like a tense conversation happening behind me. Still, occasionally, I could discern words like lawyer, consulate, papers, and deportation, enough for me to figure out that whatever was being discussed, it had something to do with immigration. It was past 9 when we finally drove into the airport's parking lot, with Sonia, her mother, and sister all possessed by the same stillness as I headed towards the international flights terminal. By now, Sonia's face had assumed a constant stoicism, her eyes weary from all the crying. But she and her mother got off the station wagon warily and said nothing as we unloaded the luggage and placed it on a metal cart that someone had conveniently left nearby, and we walked towards the gate. Only ticketed passengers were allowed past security. So right before she walked through the metal detectors, along with her mother and sister, she turned towards me to say goodbye. I hope that everything goes well for you in Mexico, Sonia, I said as I took her hand. I will be waiting for you. She gave me a quick hug, and right as she was about to turn around to get into the security queue, I will never forget what I said next to her. Look, it seems to me that you and your family are having some kind of immigration issue. Don't worry about it. Whatever I can do to help, please count on me. After all, I am also undocumented. The confused look on her face after I spoke was unlike any expression I had seen on her face before. For a moment, she remained frozen, as if she was having trouble processing what I had just disclosed. Then her mother called her and she was off. She was supposed to be back in 2 weeks, but a month passed, then 2 months, and then 3 and 4. With each passing day, I worried that she was never coming back, that she was going to remain in Mexico forever. I was getting ready to graduate from Fremont High to attend Berkeley as a summer bridge student, terrified ever since my counselor had submitted my application, uncertain about what would happen once I set foot on that campus. But now, with one drama unresolved and another one about to start, I at least wanted closure on what had happened with Sonia. Before she left, Sonia had mentioned to me that she had had a cousin living in East Oakland by the last name of Diaz. So I got on the telephone book and decided to call every Diaz that was listed. Do you know how many Diazes lived in East Oakland in the early 1980s? Almost all of them cursed me out. But after so many tries and so many people hanging up on me, someone actually answered who knew Sonia. Yes, and I know you too, she said when she picked up the telephone. I saw you at Fremont each lunchtime reading your weird books. We were in the same Spanish class when we were juniors. But haven't you heard? Sonia has been back for more than a month now. My heart stopped. Look, if you go by her house on Sunday morning, you can probably see her with my aunt working on their garden. It's right in front of their house. They do it every week. Next slide, please. That Sunday, that's just what I did. I drove by her house, and there she was. I noticed that as soon as we made eye contact, as soon as she saw my father's green station wagon driving near her house, she began to walk towards me, as if she had been expecting me. I didn't get out. I just sat there and waited as she approached. I probably should have told you something earlier, she said after she got into the passenger seat of the station wagon. I probably should have written or at least called you. It's just that when you told me that you weren't a citizen, I knew that things were not going to work out. I had liked you when I thought you were going somewhere, when I thought that you had it together and that you could help me out with my own problems, especially if things didn't work out in Mexico. But when you told me that you were also illegal, no, that could never work at all. Next slide. In many ways, you might perceive the narrative I just recounted as one-sided, akin to a tale from a Mexican immigrant telenovela where Sonia Eugenia Flores assumes the role of the antagonist. However, therein lies my point. The truth is, I never truly knew Sonia Eugenia Flores. The tragedy of our encounter lies in the possibility that we were too similar, each of us wearing a mask in our pursuit of bettering our lives and those of our families, only to realize too late, after the fatal flaw was exposed, that our similarities would only compound our suffering. Initially, I felt shocked and wounded because I believed Sonia hadn't seen the real me, that she had misconstrued my genuine desire to bring her happiness. Yet I, too, failed to see the authentic Sonia, ensnared in my endeavor to impress her and others as the epitome of the model immigrant. I overlooked the fact that the seductive persona she projected was also a disguise. In truth, a significant part of my attraction to her stemmed from the mutual deception we engaged in. She was the alluring beauty who showed interest in me instead of my friends. And in her eyes, I was likely the immigrant student most likely to succeed. Each of us projected a facade akin to Ellison's Invisible Man, crafting an image we believed could rescue us from our undocumented reality. Next slide, please. I grew up in East Oakland. As an undocumented immigrant kid in 1974, my dad arranged to bring our entire family up, my mom, my sisters, and I, from Jalisco, Mexico. At first, we thought we would be visiting just for the summer, that the most time we would spend in the US would be a few months. To this day, almost 50 years later, I have not been back to my hometown. Next slide. Indeed, the 12 years that I spent living in the heart of East Oakland as an undocumented immigrant conditioned me in a profound way and deeply affected how I behaved as a student, an academic, and now as a Berkeley administrator. Being undocumented during my formative years, as I'm sure you can imagine, meant that I always lived with the fear of being caught, that any misstep I took could endanger the entire family. Though my dad worked tirelessly, though he and my mother encouraged us to do well at school and always figured out honest ways to provide food and shelter, even when he was between jobs, being undocumented meant that we always had to act with cuidado, that we had to be extremely careful about the way we operated in our new community. Next slide, please. Thankfully, in 1986, my family and I were able to legalize our status through the amnesty program signed by Reagan. And while we were now, quote, legal, unquote, while we now supposedly had permission to work and go to school, the tentativeness and suspicion that resulted from those 12 years of conditioning did not disappear. Next slide, please. I have often wondered why, even to this day, we haven't heard more stories about what it meant to live as undocumented immigrants in the 1980s. After all, as with my family, more than 3 million people from throughout Latin America and the world normalized their status. A large number of these newly amnestied immigrants, almost 40%, also went to become citizens. Why is it then that we have not heard that many stories about their experiences? Next slide. Of course, what I've come to understand after many years of reading and doing research is that though amnesty made it easy for a generation of undocumented immigrants to come out of the shadows, it did not remove the cultural taboo that still exists in our communities regarding this experience. Next slide, please. After amnesty, I thrived as a college student. Without the specter of a possible deportation, I felt that there were no limits to what I could do. This desire to show that we are more than our legal status is what drives so many undocumented students to excel academically, to become hyper-documented, as Professor Aurora Chang puts it. It is from this process that the dreamer archetype has emerged. And while I do have serious concerns about the ways that this archetype continues to affect all undocumented immigrants, that is not the point of this conversation today. Next slide. After amnesty, and because of my hyper-documented anxiety, I pursued a doctoral degree in which I studied the representation of undocumented immigrants in Mexican narratives, Mexican American narratives. While I discovered during my studies that even there in Mexican American fiction, there was a hierarchy of immigrant status where usually undocumented subjects were only discussed implicitly in Mexican American stories in code as part of the background and not as protagonists. It led to my research focusing on the representation of undocumented immigrant experiences and how central strategic silences are to undocumented immigrant epistemologies. Let me illustrate. Next slide, please. Here are a series of panels that present, from my point of view, the way that undocumented silence is conditioned, or how it is that an epistemology based on constant fear develops among undocumented kids after years of exposure to countless situations like the ones that are presented here. This is a scene illustrated based on something that actually happened to our family. I'm going to read them. Who can it be? She whispers to Papa in the darkness as the sound of heavy feet makes the wooden steps that lead to our kitchen door thump. Like Mama and Papa, I'm also paralyzed against the room's dark blue light. Isn't this what we've waited for? Isn't this what Papa has warned us about since we crossed the border to join him? How long did we think we could hide? Next slide, please. Papa takes a step towards the kitchen. Next door, Sam, Mr. Jenkins's Cocker Spaniel, yelps his warning. Just as Papa is about to leave our bedroom, Mama says, "Cuidado, Pedro, be careful." I lay my head back on the pillow and pull the thin covers over my head, and I become a ball of flesh under the blankets. My arms wrap so tightly around my knees that my feet and calves begin to numb. Then I hear the door open. Next slide, please. "Sorry to wake you up, buddy. My name is Officer Dennison. Hey, do you know how long the old guy in the back has been living here? Do you know if he has any relatives living nearby?" It's the police, the very people Papa has warned us to avoid. I'll wait for them to tell him that they know everything, that they are here to take us away. I imagine their handcuffs on Papa, cold steel cutting his thick wrist. But I hear nothing as I sit and wait for the inevitable. Just the finches chirping outside from the nest they have built in the branches of our plum tree. Theirs is a melancholy song, a lonely whistling before the morning bustle. Maybe they know what will happen to us. The door closes with a crisp click, and I listen for Papa's footsteps. He stands still for several seconds before he heads into the bedroom and turns on the light, and we are still safe. Next slide, please. Here's all the panels together. Next slide, please. That apparent taboo around publicly discussing undocumented experience always mystified me because I strongly believed that being undocumented was a kind of American experience. In fact, when I was a young professor, I tried to write about it in critical essays, personal stories, and poetry because I wanted to initiate a public dialogue about what it meant to be undocumented in our society. Several of my colleagues expressed curiosity about my research, but the field of undocumented immigrant studies was still in its nascent stage in the early 2000s, not as developed as it's becoming today. The truth is that I became impatient about initiating this dialogue, as nothing I did seemed to work. I had waited for those 3 million others who went through the normalization process with me, and I thought that stories about their experiences would surely emerge. For the most part, there was silence. I had waited for those stories because I needed them. I needed that sense of community that comes when you know that others have gone through the same kind of trauma you have. For me, dealing with being undocumented was difficult to do on my own. I felt guilty, sometimes angry at my parents and upset, but I kept it all in. It was a solitary experience, an ordeal that I couldn't really talk about, even within my family. Next slide. So what happens to these stories? What happens to all the tragic and sometimes funny accounts of close calls or challenges overcome? Didn't amnesty mean that we were now free to talk about all that we had experienced? This exploration became an all-consuming project. And for a while, I gave it my all. I taught classes on the subject, went to professional conferences, and continued to publish whenever I could. But then when my baby daughter, Sophia, was born, and because that dialogue I wanted had not materialized, I chose to take a break from my research and I became a staff member at Berkeley. Next slide. Now, one of the most rewarding aspects of being a staff member at Berkeley was the opportunity to work with summer bridge students. Around 12 years ago, while conducting a midterm in my summer bridge Mexican American history course, my desire to initiate the dialogue I had craved resurfaced. It was the summer of 2012, and despite having only a couple of weeks left in class, significant events were unfolding across the country. The DREAM Act was again being debated by Congress, and a remarkable activism by undocumented immigrant students was gaining momentum in its support. How times have changed, huh? However, despite my eagerness to address these current events in class, I faced a dilemma. I couldn't burden my students with additional reading. They had already expressed concerns about the workload, such as the plight of having a hyper-documented professor who assigns excessive materials. How could I justify assigning more work, even just a short article or two, when the final exam was so near? Next slide, please. So as my students tackled their final midterms that summer, I find myself wrestling with that question. In a moment of contemplation, I reached for a scrap piece of paper and hastily sketched a cartoon outlining the essential points I believe they should consider on the subject, specifically what unfolds in a day in the life of a DREAM Act student. It dawned on me then, why couldn't I utilize this doodle to initialize our discussion? All I needed was a simple visual aid to spark a conversation. At our subsequent class session, I presented the completed drawing and posed a question to my students. This is not a test, but how do you perceive the similarities or differences in the strategies employed by the current undocumented immigrant student activists compared to those utilized by the Mexican American student movement of the 1960s? Without fail, my students immediately engaged with the topic, with many opting to delve into independent research. The excitement I felt from the classroom response prompted me to share the cartoon once more, this time on the Facebook account I had recently established. The response I had longed for regarding immigrant issues, that dialogue I had yearned for to foster, suddenly materialized. Within days, my circle of friends on Facebook expanded from a mere dozen to hundreds of individuals eager to engage in critical discussions about the undocumented experience, all sparked by the cartoons I created. Motivated by this newfound momentum, I began producing more images, crafting visual narratives about my undocumented life. Through cartoons, I posed philosophical inquiries about the undocumented experience, eventually laying the foundation for an illustrated memoir. Next slide, please. Of course, I think that the main reason the cartoons hit a nerve that my essays and historians could not do had everything to do with the form. As the saying goes, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Here I was creating visual essays, communicating the same ideas I had been researching for decades with cartoons that I was crafting. I realized that my students were also more accustomed to consuming visual text. Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, Pinterest, all of this developed in them literacy skills for quickly digesting ideas and images. It quickly became clear, next slide please, to me that the effectiveness of my cartoon memoir stemmed from its adaptable narrative form. I didn't need to adopt a rigid scholarly tone to maintain its credibility. In my cartoon, the four narrative wall was flexible, I could seamlessly transition between an erudite, all-knowing narrator and a vulnerable first-person witness to the same story without causing any dissonance for the viewer. Next slide, please. What's intriguing is that I had already grasped this lesson on narrative perspective many years earlier, during my time in high school. However, my conviction was so strong that the only way my undocumented story would be accepted was through an overly academic lens that I hadn't even considered cartoons as a legitimate tool for exploration. Despite all my years of academic training I had received in graduate school, I had been conditioned to believe that dense textual analysis was the sole method for sharing my undocumented experience. I should have known better, and here's why. Next slide, please. In high school, I had a teacher, Mrs. Wolf, who thought that I had some academic potential. And so she nominated me for a scholarship competition without me knowing it. One day, she informed me about what she had done, and it totally terrified me in the process. Had I known it, I would have certainly never had applied for the scholarship. After all, it was a scholarship to go to Washington, D.C., to interact with all branches of government. When I told my dad what Mrs. Wolf had done about her nomination, he became incensed. Nowhere will you go, he said. You will get us all deported. You better find a way so you can't do it. Next slide, please. Several days after Ms. Wolf had told me, I received a letter inviting me to a preliminary interview along with other candidates. My dad repeated his warning, you better not do it. It was at this time that I decided that the best way to avoid danger of not going to Washington, the best way that I could obey my father and keep my family safe was by failing the interview, but doing it in such a way that Ms. Wolf might still hear good things about my effort. My strategy was that whenever I was asked questions, that I would take the Cantinflas approach, that technique pioneered by the brilliant Mexican comic of seemingly answering questions with sophisticated sounding gibberish without really answering them, of responding by using the thesaurus without really offering any substance. I was so naive. I did not realize that what the interview committee was looking for was someone who was diplomatic, someone who was polite and would not ruffle any feathers with the politicians in Washington. So I ended up winning something I was intending to lose. Next slide, please. I had to go to Washington, D.C., and I almost died a spiritual death every moment that I was there. Every moment was a distressing experience. The program was so prestigious that we were given access to the White House, the Capitol building, the Smithsonian, the Supreme Court. But the one place where we were supposed to go that caused me the most concern was the FBI building. In my mind, I thought that if I was going to be caught anywhere in Washington, D.C., it would surely be there in the home of the best detectives on earth. Next slide, please. I still remember that day. Here I was, an undocumented kid at the FBI, about to take my final tour of the program, sweating so profusely that I was shining. That's when I noticed that the people in the crowd were pointing at me and grinning as I moved. I tried to walk away from them, hiding behind groups in the crowd, but people everywhere were still looking at me. Students, guards, men and women in suits and briefcases, all staring at me and grinning. I thought of my father's words, that his worst fears had come true, and that I had finally been found out. They all knew that I was undocumented and now enjoyed watching me suffer. And just as I was about to go through the metal detector, just as I was about to enter into the vastness of the FBI headquarters, the kid who was my roommate at our hotel walked up to me with a smile on his face. I almost wanted to beat him to the punch to tell him that yes, I was undocumented and that I had had enough, that I just wanted to be sent home. He leaned close to my ear and told me that my pants zipper had been unzipped for most of the day. I looked down and sure enough, the cheap zipper on the black pinstripe suit that my father had bought me at Oakland's Eastmont Mall so that I could blend in had busted, revealing the white Fruit of the Looms like neon. I tried to pull up my zipper so fast that I actually broke it. But I didn't care. The boy had said nothing about my immigration status, so I felt relieved. I realized in that moment that the fear about my being undocumented, that fear that I had about being caught and deported, that fear resided in my head. What other things had I not permitted myself to do because of my need to feel safe? What opportunities had I turned down because of all the threats I perceived? Next slide. As you can see, cartooning has allowed me to communicate these existential fears more effectively than my writing. This is the reason that I created my illustrated memoir. And yet there's only so much this little book can do. The anti-immigrant policies that are now aiming to persecute undocumented immigrants across the country are too real, not just a byproduct of worried imaginations. This program, however, is not just aimed at undocumented immigrants. The attack on undocumented immigrants is just but the most obvious aspect of what seems to be a larger policy that has taken aim at the heart of what used to be American progressive democracy, the social infrastructure that, as a result of the labor organizing and social activism of the 1930s and 60s, increased access to education, healthcare, and legal protections for all working class and poor people. My belief is that working class and poor people of all ethnic backgrounds now need each other more than ever, and that we cannot let false debates based on false moralisms detract us from our common humanity. To view undocumented immigrant experience in the US as a totally unredeemable experience that needs to be excised without exception is to buy into a false equivalency that has already stopped us from discerning what is lawful versus what is just. Next slide. This is why I have chosen to confront my fears surrounded my undocumented status, because I cannot expect others to empathize with the undocumented community unless I first acknowledge and embrace the entirety of my own undocumented experience. Despite my apprehensions, I feel compelled to take on the responsibility, imperfect as it may be, of sharing my undocumented American life to honor the individuals who have inspired hope within me, my parents, community, and teachers. I must particularly acknowledge my parents, the visionaries behind the pursuit of a better life. It is their resilience that fortifies my purpose and the purpose of all undocumented students striving for self-improvement. Next slide, please. However, the harsh reality of our current circumstances cannot be overlooked. Things are undeniably difficult. We face formidable challenges, and there is much to fear. Yet I offer this advice as a source of hope. The fear we experience in navigating a seemingly hostile world can also serve as a catalyst for supporting our families and communities. It provides us with a sense of urgency and motivation as we press forward. The same fear was undoubtedly felt by our parents as they sought to improve their own lives. It is a natural human emotion that we must not avoid, but rather seek to comprehend. In my role as Assistant Dean for Arts and Humanities at the University of California, next slide, please, I had witnessed a surge of undocumented scholars overcoming these fears and entering academia. Ambitious graduate students and researchers gaining acceptance into doctoral programs. Some are now completing their PhDs and securing positions at universities nationwide. I sometimes ponder the possibility that these scholars will pioneer a new academic discipline. Next slide, please. Centered on their unique American experiences, a field perhaps titled Undocumented American Studies. And that would be remarkable. In the years to come, scholars in this emerging field will document its early development, chronicling how students, driven by courage to face fear, forged this academic terrain from virtually nothing, driven solely by willpower and determination. These very students will soon become your professors, This is why I maintain hope. Despite the intolerance we endure and the obstacles meant to derail us, the resilient spirit that guided our parents in their pursuit for a better life continues to thrive. Thank you so much for extending the invitation.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. Well, first of all, wow, that was amazing and so beautiful. I just want to say thank you. I'm not sure if you've had this response before, Alberto, but it made me feel so relaxed. Just listening to you tell that, which ended up really being this wonderful, beautiful story. So, thank you, thank you. And I want to make sure, please, folks, if you have questions, put them in the chat. And I'm gonna ask some questions. Here is one. Please ask questions. There's so many things to ask. I want to actually ask a quick question myself before going to some of the ones that are being submitted. And that is the images that you showed at that kind of flow along with your story. Were those done over a long period of time? Okay, so I was just really curious about like what's the oldest one that you had and how long ago might it have been done?
Probably the one Mrs. Wolf,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, I have dozens and dozens of art journals that I fill. I mean, I'm always, I mean, I carry them everywhere. So I'm
Hmm.
always drawing. I have a series called Lunchtime Sketches, just
Yeah, I
whenever,
know that. Yeah.
I mean, it's included in the book also. And I see that there's one of the attendees asking questions about current politics. And I'm
Yeah.
always paying attention to current politics because I reflect on that. The LA Times, for example, had asked me to do an illustrated opinion piece based on something that happened a few years ago. And I already had it because I had drawn a response to that situation. And,
Mm.
and and that's also why the art looks so like it's evolved because I've been practicing a lot, and when I saw that my art was getting a response, I started focusing on my craft also. And that's also why I think, when I talk to my students, I say, it, you know, you have a story to tell.
Hmm.
And if you say that you can't write, that's not acceptable because as long as you have a story to tell, just start writing it and the skill will come as long as you start writing.
Oh, thank you, thank you. And to go to that question, um, given what has been happening with politics around undocumented immigration today, how do you recommend that today's students deal with, the hatred, the intolerance they're confronted with every day? I mean, I thought it was so interesting when you discovered the amount of pressure you were putting on yourself, but there still are threats, right? So can you talk
Yeah,
a bit about that?
yeah. So I mean, so it's real. I mean, I think the fact is that it's real, but I think the other fact is that your own brilliance and your own talent is also real. And one of the things that in working with undocumented students, as far as long as I've been working with, uh, um, I've been impressed just by students, particularly who have gotten to, and I would say, so one of the issues with the dreamer archetype is that it suggests that every dreamer is a genius, and that's a problem, right? Because I have a really dear friend of mine who said, well, there's also the 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 nightmare, right? We're currently going through a nightmare. So maybe most students who are facing undocumented issues in education, nightmares, rather than dreamers, right? That might be more appropriate. But the fact is that when you're put into pressure situations, And this is where the Cantinflas metaphor comes into play. So the way the Cantinflas became Cantinflas, and I use this a lot with my students, Cantinflas became a brilliant comic because of improvisation. Cantinflas had actually been a boxer before he was a vaudevillian actor. And he was a terrible boxer. He kept getting knocked out. And so, he then became a vaudevillian actor, but, he wasn't that, he was okay as an actor. But then they did this comedy routine. And in one of the sketches that he did, he forgot his lines. And so he was in front of the stage, and he forgot his lines. And I don't know about you, but if I forget my lines in front of the stage, that's one of the biggest fears I have. I would just like run away, right? But instead of running away, what he did is he improvised, and he came up with this language, and people started laughing hysterically at the language that he came up with, mocking the rich and powerful in Mexico. And that became his shtick, and the shtick that he started using till the end of his, till he died, right? He became like, he almost ran for the presidency in Mexico based on this persona that he discovered in the height of pressure. Now, I'm not saying that the pressure he faced there is analogous to the pressure that undocumented students face, but what happens with undocumented students is that often that pressure that they put themselves in also allow them to discover, because of their creativity, these amazing possibilities. It's like a diamond, right? You create, your creativity and your resourcefulness creates new possibilities. And that's what I ask them to focus on. We're dealing with, really difficult issues, but you do have resourcefulness. You have creativity. You can use art, you can use writing, you can use your networks. Why is it that undocuart, undocuqueer art, for example, has become so prolific? You have these amazing movements that have emerged in the last few years, that have been very irreverent in really creating a very vital counter narrative to the hate. And that's because they're doing that. And that's what I would ask. I would invite students to pursue doing that. Don't keep it in, but find a way to let that voice that wants to speak. If you don't give it voice, it's not, you need to let it out. It would, your brilliance is going to manifest once you start letting it out.
Yeah, oh, I love that. Thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
for that. We have lots of questions. So, let's see. Here's one. A question. You mentioned the importance of scholarship and theory around undocumented centered experiences. I'm curious to learn about your decision to transition from faculty to administration. How did that have an impact on your research and art? It's a great question.
Just because you transition from one point, from one publish or perish track to another doesn't mean that you stop doing theory. I'm doing more organic theory, but my kind of work around undocumented epistemology has not stopped. In fact, I think when I switched over to staff work, it gave me freedom in many ways. I'm doing alternative academic work, right? I still remain connected to a very large community of writers and academics in the area. I continue going to research conferences, to the extent that I could. I continue publishing, and continue doing committee work in this area. And I think you want to keep your brain stimulated in this area. Still, the issue is that in the formal disciplines, the disciplines don't move as fast as the field as the issue does. And in undocumented studies, there's no real discipline that is hosting it right now, right? And so for me, I had waited for a discipline to adopt it. This is a multidisciplinary kind of area. And so I just moved past it, and because of what I do, I merge, philosophy with, kind of creative nonfiction with, art. All these things come together in the work that I do. Sometimes, a cartoon that I do is really, like I said, in my work, It's really an illustrated essay, because I'm posing those kinds of questions there. And that, I like having that freedom right now. But I do, one of the things that I am very excited about is now there's a critical mass of scholars who have gone into formal disciplines who are beginning to carve out, I think, in some crevices in the disciplines for undocumented immigrant work, formally. I think in education, certainly, in ethnic studies for sure, in sociology. I think in the humanities, I think we're just beginning to do that there. Yeah.
Nice, nice. Thank you, thank you. Here's a question that I really like. How did your parents react when you published your book?
Oh my God. So at first they didn't know what to make of it. They were kind of a little ambivalent, but my mom is always happy for whatever I do. She doesn't care. She just has unconditional love, so that's I was scared about my dad, because my dad, he has the fel fuerte formal kind of identity, kind of very stoic, so the week that the book came out, I had given my parents several copies of the book, and I went to visit them in East Oakland, and I was very afraid when I got to the house in East Oakland. And I got there with my wife and my daughter. My daughter was still, little. And we usually enter through the kitchen door, which is on the side of the house. And I enter, and the room smelled amazing because my mom was cooking something. And she gave me this big hug, congratulations, your book came out. And she was like so proud. And then my sisters, kind of gave me a begrudging hug too, it's like, kind of teased me about it. And then they said, oh, that's in the front, as usual, right? And go see him. And I'm like, oh man, like, let me go take my lumps. Like, so I was gonna go there to see. And I went, and right as I opened the door to the front of the house, he was on the phone with our family in Mexico. And I opened the door, and I'm like, very fearful. And he was, oh, did you see? I'm on page 20. Yeah, it's really cool. He was proud. He was like, even though I had been critical of him in the book, he was so proud of it. I almost cried. He hugged me. He gave me this big old bear hug, when I came in. And he asked me if I had more copies. He wanted to give them to his friends. And it was one of the tenderest moments that I've had with my dad in my life, at that moment, And ever since then, our relationship has been very different. But I think when you insist on truth, sometimes you find that you tell the truth not just for yourself, but for others too.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing so much of yourself too. Really, really appreciate that. Okay, here's another question. Do you envision an area of study or major in undocumented studies, a department at an institution? Does any university even offer such a thing already? And says also, I am an undocumented PhD student at UCSC. I assume that's Santa Cruz. Without work authorization. What comes after I attain my degree? Have you heard of PhD graduates getting hired by institutions and sponsored to adjust their status? And then thank you so much for your beautiful work.
Yeah, I mean, I've known of previously undocumented or undocumented PhDs getting work, and I don't know all the details about how they did it. What I do know is that they were undocumented, got a PhD, and next thing you know, they're working. And so I have no idea how they did it, but I do know that happens. And so I know that the we have different institutions that have different levels of agency in being able to do that, right? There's the Genius Visa, for example, that sometimes people can use. And so, there's Javier Zamora has been asking this question. He was a previously undocumented student who wrote a book that was nominated for a Pulitzer, but he wasn't able to get it because he had been undocumented. There were rules around that, right? And it just formed a scandal, right? He was actually he read for the Pulitzer, but he couldn't actually nominate someone who had gone through it, right? And so that had been somewhat of a scandal. And so I think it's a great question in terms of fields that might be hosting undocumented studies. I think that it's a question of having critical mass of people who are doing the work. And I do think that there's been enough faculty who have been sponsoring students this way. When DACA happened, there were enough students who got into graduate school and began programs, who are going to be finishing programs, that I think that's a possibility, because a number of students who in DACA, I mean, not all of them studied undocumented subjects, but many of them did. Um, I do think that's a possibility. One of the issues, or one of the questions that comes up, I mean, subaltern studies establish a precedent where marginality as a focus for analysis, became, a way to look at experience, and to look at, to take a lens to understand, the ways that, sociologically folks, kind of, we can interpret human dynamics. And I think that undocumentedness, as a kind of subalternity, can be, there can be that can be, uh, uh, um, it can be extended, it can be unified. And I think that there's a number of places where you can have that kind of theorization happening. But it's going to require, I think, dedicated focus. I think, collaborations by scholars who are doing multidisciplinary work. I can see folks, let's say in ethnic studies, and again, sociology. I can see, certainly philosophy, maybe, even performance studies, being able to do this. And it's going to require progressive universities, where you have academic freedom, and also folks allowing faculty promotion on the basis of this kind of work, and being able to defend the faculty in their promotion to do this work, because there's going to be this work will be politicized. And if the universities, and particularly donors in the universities, get scared by faculty doing this work, a lot of universities are going to be skittish about supporting this work. And so it's going to be brave universities. And I think, most likely it will be in California and New York, that you'll see, this happening.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that.
And maybe Mellon will sponsor something.
Right, I was thinking that too. I was thinking
Yeah.
foundations, definitely.
Yeah.
So we did have someone say that they had gone through this and they'd be happy to help folks. So I'm gonna just ask our team if they can put that information in the chat, because it's in the Q&A, so we can send it out to people. I've got time for a few more questions. Here's a good one. What kinds of things do you do to maintain a positive sense of mental health in today's political climate?
So, what I studied in graduate school was narrative. And that's part of the reason that I work on narrative, and, trying to, because I know that, and that's why I focus on undocumented immigrant experience as a kind of a pre-American narrative. That's how I see it, right? And I mean, if you look at immigrant stories as a continuum, I mean, this fits into that, right? And so, I mean, the current political climate that we're living in is part of a political. I mean, there's a continuum of xenophobic narrative in the U.S. that has existed for a long, long time, and it's no different than what has been here in the past. And so I think that in terms of maintaining mental health, it's just to think about having counter narratives to balance out kind of the negativity, right? And so being able to cut through the negative, the constant drum of negative lies, that you're getting about, the community and the policies that people are trying to push forth, that is just, it's an agenda that is meant to hide other issues. The fact is that I think, part of, and this is what I try to advance in my talk, I think what's really happening in the US is that there's a demographic shift that is fairly serious. And, there's a fear of really grappling with the responsibility of that demographic shift in terms of, how to, be socially accountable to it in a fair way, right? How to really, in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of, equity, if we're trying to be fair, across, nationally, how do you do that? And so I think that when you have a population where clearly we've had policies that have been inequitable, and certainly we have a history of anti-Black racism, for example. Undocumented immigration sits on top of that, and this this you know this narrative that we're hearing is a continuum to that, and so I think the best things that you can do is read history, equip yourself intellectually in terms of understanding the mechanics of U.S. society, and just know that you know the same things that shifted our society in the past can shift our societies in the future in terms of uh, making sure that you understand that you know people that push for changes in society in the past was based on their understanding of truth and fairness. The labor movement was based on that. Suffrage was based on that. And so if you insist on it, that's going to do the same thing in the future too.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Let's see. I think we might be able to get to both of these. Here's one. Has the undocumented fear that you felt or feel changed given the undocumented, unafraid, and unapologetic movement?
So I have a cartoon that I did. It was about a visit that I did to Disneyland one time, and I have this placard in front of me says, um, you know, uh, I think it says still afraid. I think that it said, because I think that the unafraid movement, it happened while Obama was in the in the um, in the Oval Office, and I think there was a window of time where there were certain policy changes that we had an opportunity, and I thought it was great. I mean, it was fantastic, that we were able to do what we did, and I thought it was amazing. That movement was amazing because it has led to policy changes. I mean, I think what happened in California, the AB 540 policy, for example, and a lot, even policies that have given financial aid to undocumented immigrants, not just in California, but New York and other places, were all the result of that attitude. And it was led by students. It was a student-led movement, analogous to the civil rights movement, right? And that happened. But again, there's been a pendulum, kind of swing, a change. And I think that now I don't think, while I think that the climate for that movement has changed a little, those students are still around. And I think that we just need to kind of rethink the approach and rethink the strategy, rethink the way that we can appeal to kind of this mass of ambivalent, the neutral community who are supposed to be nonpartisan, who are trying to decide, between the two, the bifurcated division in our society. I think that there's a tension right now. In our society, there, when you talk about dreamers, there's still this ethical dilemma that a large part of our society feels about wanting to do something about dreamers, and yet they still are getting manipulated around immigration. And so I think that there might be an opportunity at some point, but there are momentary issues, and so my sense, around the undocumented and unafraid is the moment may not be ripe right now for a reawakening of that particular strategy, but it doesn't mean that the folks who use that strategy will not be able to use a similar kind of move soon, given, uh, um, hopefully friendly leaders or ethical opportunities that might present themselves. You know, I just think that our society knows that, you know, I mean, people, especially when I talk to folks, you know, we know that we're diverse. And I think most people want to be able to live harmoniously in a diverse society. I don't think it feels good to live in a society where we are so segregated and always at each other's throat. I think people rather not live that way. I think people rather will find a way to find positive public policy to work with each other. And so we just need to find an opening for that and be able to frame it in a way that is respectful of the sides.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think I have time for this one last question. What's the best advice to a Chicana attempting to navigate a career in higher ed administration while wanting to help underrepresented students, but facing roadblocks because of unjust policy practices and people who don't understand what it takes to help these students?
Oh, that's tough. I mean, I think right now, I mean, we're seeing this around the politics of the IBJ nationally, right? You know, that there's a lot of retrenchment around these policies. I think that having a voice around the table that that represents your perspective, that, you know, a Chicana perspective is important. And I think being able um, to be honest and be authentic is really important. At the same time, I think being able to be honest about your experience in a way that establishes commonplace with the community that you're in is important. And I think that the assumption right now is that DIBJ efforts, or when we are, you know, leaders of color and we come into communities that are more homogeneous, that we're going to be oppositional all the time, that you know, that there's a resistance, and I think that, you know, it's really important to find ways to figure out, you know, what is the entry point, what is the dialogue, the commonplace dialogue by which we can you know, address policies that are low-hanging fruit first, and then after we address those policies, eventually get to some of the more difficult, you know, policies. But by having you first around the table, that matters. It matters for students who are at the university. It matters for other staff who might be wanting to apply, other leaders who might be wanting to apply. It matters to faculty. It really does matter. And so, you know, and it matters, I think, you know, just for the administrators who will then get used to the perspective, and then, you know, if there comes a point where it's just too much and you got to say your piece, then you use it at that point, then you say your piece. But, you know, I think, you know, if it's possible, you know, to be able to you know, have a commonplace development of policy where, you know, you can participate in that. I think that's really important. This is what Tomás Rivera, when he was the chancellor of Riverside, he was the first Latino chancellor of a UC, although he died young as a result of that. But that was his philosophy. And you know, I mean, again, you know, I think, again, when you're young, you know, you're building the bicycle as you're riding it. But I thought that was a pretty wise, you know, approach. And I think when you are, you know, charting the path, you know, I think when you persist, eventually others show up to back you up, and that you know, but yeah, I mean, that question resonates, and you know, you really have my support.
Thank you. I was going to wrap up, but I thought I'd give you the opportunity. There's one last question that came in. I'll say it really briefly. It says, thank you for starting your presentation by referencing the violence in the occupied Palestinian territories, especially related to the traumatic impact to children. making such references to empathy toward Palestinians and overtly expressing concern over the various implications has become largely taboo in higher ed. A lot of people are afraid to speak out. And the person is, Jorge, he's asking, do you feel that your ability to do so is a result of and informed by your lived experiences with the taboo topic of undocumented immigration in the US? And so I thought that would be an interesting question for us to wrap up on. So
Yeah, I mean, my title is, Assistant Dean for Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity. I just believe in being inclusive and being respectful, and the I I believe that there is innocent people are being hurt, and that's is happening both in Palestine. It's also happening at the southern border, and I just wanted to note that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, overall, I just want to say thank you. This was amazing. Thank you for being so honest and vulnerable and real. And this is such an amazing example for any students listening, but I also think it's an amazing example for faculty listening and anyone who's chiming in. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for the beautiful artwork, your beautiful words, and just spending time with us. We really, really appreciate that. Thanks to the attendees and to our staff, especially Giselle and Natalie, who have been helping behind the scenes to get everything ready, our staff at Proctor and CMSI. And we, as always, a big thank you to the Mellon Foundation for sponsoring this kind of great work. They sponsor so many wonderful things across the country that have to do with the humanities, and we're incredibly grateful. So thank you, Alberto. Thank you, everyone. Have a
Thank you
great
so much, Mary Beth, for continuing to do these kinds of amazing events. And thank you to everyone that you just mentioned. Again, this is an amazing program. Thank you.
All right. Take good care, everybody.
All right. Take care.